For the next stage of our exploration of leadership, we're going to hear from Dr. Sanjay Jha, who is the co-CEO of Motorola and the CEO of Motorola Mobile. He was born in India. His higher education was in the UK. He spent 14 years at Qualcomm, and in the last 2 years and 14 days, as he informs me, but who is counting, he's been in the middle of a very celebrated transformation at Motorola. So we're going to talk about what he's learned from this experience, his observations of the mobile world, his thoughts about the computing future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanjay Jha. Let me start, before we get to talking about your recent business experience, with a carryover question from our first session. You heard a lot of presentations about the relative secular decline of the United States and some Western economies in general, relative and specific to China and India. You're part of the movement that, in my view, has always strengthened the United States, that is, its abilities to attract talent from around the world. How do you feel about the sense of the mood of American declinism you heard this morning?
My general view is that certainly over the last few years, we've gone through a process where there is a need for renewal in the United States, but the strength of US has always been the ability to attract some of the brightest and the best people. I think probably if there's one concern is some of our immigration policies are getting in the way of being able to attract those folks. But nonetheless, I think this constant sense of renewal that's built into the technology as well as the culture of US, I think, enables us to compete as effectively as ever. I mean, there's no doubt that there were excesses in the economic system, but equally there is no doubt that there is more investment being made in the next generation technologies here in US than nearly anywhere else. So I look at what we have done with the cloud computing, Google at the head of that. I look at what has happened to the US auto industry. I look at Motorola in the cell phone business, last really important cell phone manufacturer. And I think that there is every capability for us to reinvent ourselves here in the United States. I remain very, very optimistic.
And so your Indian counterparts, a generation younger than you, would they be as interested in coming to the US as you were?
I think it'll depend on a number of things. I think our education system here still continues to be some of the best. I think that certainly is attractive. I think if we continue to create corporations like Google, like Motorola, I think they'd be interested. But more and more, I think a vast majority of Indians are now staying in India and creating opportunities. But we shouldn't see that as lack of opportunity for our corporations. I think that creates vast opportunities for us in those countries also.
Let's talk now about your current company, about Motorola. You've been there a little more than 2 years, as you were saying. Describe, if you would, the situation that faced you when you arrived and what you've learned from your decisions, good and perhaps less good since then, but we'll assume all good.
Well, in 2006, we had $28 billion of revenue at the back of the Razor franchise. And post the Razor franchise, I think we were losing money at the rate of about $1 billion a quarter. It was a pretty dire situation. I think it was broadly being discussed that we should shut down the handset business in Motorola. And I was at that time relatively comfortable position of chief operating officer of a Google-like franchise. And I made the decision to move to Motorola and take the challenge of turning around Motorola, largely because I fundamentally believe that there is probably a larger opportunity here in technology, in the combination of internet and making it mobile, delivering content and information in a mobile environment. And I just believe that that is the largest technology opportunity that there ever has been. And I felt that at Motorola, given its brand name, given its distribution reach, I could make a difference. So that led me to that place where I said, yes, I will take on this job from really a place of great comfort. And I think the thing that I found was this almost complete lack of optimism inside the organization. There have been 7 precedents in the course of 3 years at that organization. So there was clearly a leadership vacuum at Motorola. But the bigger issue was that I think everyone there was looking for the next Razor. It was still a company which was looking for a voice-centric device rather than embracing the almost seismic shift that was occurring in technology at that time. And I think the biggest change for me was to get people to buy into that vision while I was taking $1.5 billion of cost out of the organization.
And so what, as you look back on these 2 years, a question both, is there anything you would do differently? And you have a colleague, you know, Mr. Elop, who's taking on a similar challenge at Nokia. You don't want to be advising your competitors, but if someone were advising him based on your last 2 years, what recommendations do you think they would offer?
Advising your competitors is an exercise in futility, so I won't do that. But I think first thing I would say to Stephen is that make sure that he connects with the Finnish culture in some way. I think almost the biggest challenge in front of him is to be able to make sure that he gets the information that allows him to make rational decisions. And I was happy to see Finland was third on the list of very happy countries, flourishing countries. That certainly is a positive thing that he will have to tap into. But there is a very strong cultural element in Finland, and he has to make sure that that cultural element is aligned with his strategy. Anytime strategy and culture collide, strategy always loses. So there has to be an alignment. That's probably the second thing on a more personal level, I would say, is that he needs to have a confidant who's connected to the Finnish culture that he can lean on and learn from. Strategically, I won't advise, but moving aside to Motorola, moving back to Motorola a little bit, I think that was probably the biggest challenge. I came from the West Coast, and Motorola is a Chicago Midwest company where the winters are extreme. And it formulates a certain culture and a certain way of looking at the world. And my view, probably the largest contribution in Chicago has been to make it feel like a high technology company rather than a Midwest hardware company. And I would say that Steve has to figure out with clarity what is the strategic direction that he wants to take and communicate that and align it as well as he could with the culture of the company.
And let me ask you a little bit more about making Motorola feel like a high-tech company, having it feel like a startup. Professor Seligman was telling us about ways you can learn different kinds of performance. It's relatively easy in the startup, especially on the West Coast, to have a certain esprit. But if startups succeed, they become mature companies, and they become more set in their ways. How exactly did you try to do this at Motorola, and what lessons do you extract from that?
Very specifically, I picked 4 groups that I thought were doing very, very advanced work at that time, and I made them successful. I rewarded them, I gave them resources to make them successful, and that success was the basis on which I think an organization saw where we wanted to head. There were a very small number of small successes, and we built upon them one at a time, and I think that was the core of it. I think being clear about the strategy and being clear on who are the key people who will drive that success to the next level was important for us. As I think about how do you keep that startup culture in large organizations, I think my fundamental sense is that new ideas can only be born when there is some dying of the old ideas, and how you kill old ideas whose time has come and passed, I think that became important for us. We weren't making money. One of the big things for me at Motorola was that there was no doubt that we were in crisis. There are lots of companies around the world who have $5-7 billion of cash flow, who are, in my opinion, in technological crisis. But it's very difficult to bring transformation if there is no sense of that crisis, that sense of imminent death. And I felt that we had that, and that was a huge advantage to me in being able to convince people that we needed to do things differently. In terms of startup, I think in terms of innovation, again, I have always felt that there's an innovating class in every company. To innovate, you must have understanding of a broad range of subjects, and the confluence of those subjects creates the innovation. And it's a matter of sponsoring and providing room for that innovating class to develop new ideas. That was the core of it. I felt I had to connect with maybe 50 to 100 core engineers in a company at Motorola who were doing things of consequence, and give them room and give them resources to succeed.
And if those engineers, the ones you are trying to enlist in this cultural change, if they were explaining your message to their friends and their coworkers, what would be the distilled version of the message that you were trying to impart to them?
That's a good question. I would think that they would say that this convergence that we're seeing of wireless mobility, you've seen iPad, you've seen smartphones, our own droids, that is the path for us to grow at Motorola, and that alone is the way for us to move forward. That all the other work that was going on, I took a huge amount of cost out of that, and that they must find to align with that. And if they didn't align with that, then I don't think we would succeed. I think that this central focus on one single thing that was going to be our future, I think that's hopefully the message that they deliver.
Great. Let me ask you about a couple of topics relatively in the news now. Under your leadership, Motorola has made a big bet on Android.
That's right.
Could you describe the operating system environment, the operating system struggles as you see them in the mobile space?
So obviously there are two fundamental views. One is open, horizontal operating environment like Android, perhaps Windows Mobile. And the second one is RIM and Apple with their vertically integrated systems and closed systems. My view is that I think that either of the two ways, the close integration of hardware and software and end-to-end service delivery is going to be the way to meet consumer requirements. And I think it's possible to do that both in a horizontal way, in an open way, in the Android way, and in a controlled environment in the way that Apple delivers that experience. I actually think that the pace of innovation, though, in the open environment has proven to be much, much higher. RIM clearly has a franchise. I think time will tell as to how innovative they will be and how they can sustain that pace of innovation. But if you look over the last 2 years, I think the pace of innovation in the Android franchise and Android ecosystem has been meaningfully higher in my view. And as a result of it, I think we are clearly now seen as the contender to the Apple franchise. And I believe that over a short period of time, I think you will see us delivering much higher quality of experiences because of this sense of openness, because of our ability to garner innovation from lots of different places. And so I think both of them are viable economic models, but I think in the long term, the open model seems to, at the present time, delivering much higher rate of innovation.
And here's a related news question, the whole net neutrality debate. Our sponsoring institution, Google, here has recently and somewhat controversially taken a stand with Verizon with their manifesto on net neutrality. Could you describe what you see as the merits of this issue and how you think it will and should play out?
Well, certainly, I think the ability to deliver all applications and all services without regard to who is delivering it and what services are being delivered, I think that in principle, that's a fundamental principle that must be supported very strongly. On the other hand, I think that we need to understand that Verizon or AT&T probably invest $50 to $20 billion in capital expenditure every year. And we must have an economic system which gives them motivation to continue to invest that. Only 2 years ago, we could only get, I don't know, 10 to 20 kilobits per second data rate. Now we can get megabits per second a data rate. And as a result of it, it's enabled the level of innovation. 50% of all phones sold in the United States are smartphones. Without that data network, there is just not that innovation. So I think as much as we want to make every application available in a uniform way, we need to make sure that the economic incentive to invest that kind of capital expenditure doesn't go away. And I just think that there are some very complex issues here. Which, without going into the details, I would simply say that economic incentive has to be in place.
Right. And just so just follow up for one further turn, the basic division that Google and Verizon proposed, which is in the wired infrastructure, you'd have sort of strict net neutrality, but not in the wireless. Is that from your point of view, a sensible guideline going forward?
The two networks certainly are fundamentally different. In wireless space, if you want to deliver quality of service and the same, that the cost of that is dramatically different. And there's no way that they have to be, there's absolutely agreement that they have to be treated differently.
Right.
Yeah.
We only have about 2 more minutes here. I want to ask you a final question before we bring you back for the panel. We heard in the previous presentation from Professor Seligman trying to be specific about what it means to be hopeful, what it means to be optimistic. In your business, innovativeness, risk-taking, et cetera, these are the mantras everybody talks about, but in specific, what do you do to try to have learned innovativeness, to cultivate what's the right degree of risk-taking, and how do you do it among your employees?
With great deal of difficulty, I think. But I think the notion of flourishing seems to be such an important notion, and I actually really, just listening to Professor Seligman, I was thinking that we ought to start measuring the quality of our innovation as it correlates to the quality of flourishing in the organization. I just think, again, the way, to answer your question more precisely, I think what I like to do is to allow people to take risk, but try to kill as many projects early as I could as they begin to seem like they're not going to deliver the results. Starting many different projects seems to be the right thing, but continuing those projects to conclusions virtually always guarantees that none of them succeed. So the decision to kill projects is nearly as important for us as decision to start. I think the threshold for starting projects I have kept to be quite low, but the threshold for letting them continue beyond a certain phase I have kept quite high.
So the fail quickly motto was
absolutely fail
to
quickly.
Move ahead in innovation.
Yeah.
There's many more things I'd like to ask you. I think we've come to the end of this session now. So please sit with me here while we introduce the next session, then we'll both come back jointly for the panel.